What if the history books have only told you half the story? Robert E. Lee, often labeled as the most controversial Confederate general, is a figure shrouded in both admiration and disdain. Born into a legacy of military excellence, Lee's life was marked by triumphs and tragedies that shaped not only his destiny, but also the fate of a nation. While many know him as a brilliant tactician on the battlefield, few are aware of the personal struggles and moral dilemmas that haunted him. From his early days at Stratford Hall, where he learned the ways of Southern aristocracy, to his rise through the ranks of the U.S. Army, Lee's journey was anything but straightforward. He faced heartbreaking losses, including the death of family members and the burden of managing his father-in-law's estate, which included enslaved people tied to a complex web of family and morality. As tensions escalated in America, Lee found himself torn between loyalty to his beloved Virginia and his duty to the Union. His decision to lead Confederate forces marked a pivotal turn in his life, thrusting him into a role that would define not just his legacy, but also the future of a divided nation. As we peel back the layers of his life, prepare to discover the complexities that history often overlooks: his struggles with slavery, his internal conflicts during pivotal battles, and the profound impact he had on both sides of this tragic conflict. Join us as we unravel the enigmatic figure of Robert E. Lee, revealing truths that challenge our understanding of history itself. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. Robert E. Lee was born on January 19, 1807, at Stratford Hall in Virginia, into the Lee family. His father, Henry Lee III, was known as Light Horse Harry, a famous general during the Revolutionary War and the 9th governor of Virginia. Robert was the 8th of 9 children. He was not very close to his father, who faced financial problems in his later years and ended up in debtor's jail several times before moving to the West Indies. He passed away in Georgia in 1818. Robert grew up in a world of Southern aristocracy, similar to what you might call the upper class. His ancestors, including Richard Lee, built Stratford Hall, and like the Washingtons, the Lees were important figures in Virginia society. Growing up on the Stratford Hall plantation, Robert learned to be a proper Southern gentleman. However, being the youngest child meant he had little chance of inheriting the family estate. Instead, he decided to join the military. His uncle, William Henry Fitzhugh, worked as a speechwriter for John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of War at that time. With his uncle's help, Lee got an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point in the summer of 1825. He did very well in school, especially in engineering, which had become a key focus at the academy. In 1829, Lee graduated second in his class of 45 and was made a brevet second lieutenant in the Army Engineer Corps. Sadly, this was also when he returned to Virginia to find his mother on her deathbed. She passed away on July 26, 1829. The following month marked the start of his military career, where he traveled from post to post helping build coastal defenses like Fort Pulaski and Fort Monroe in Georgia. During that summer, he began dating Mary Custis. Mary was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, who was adopted by George Washington himself. After her grandfather's death, Mr. Custis chose to stay near Mount Vernon and built Arlington House overlooking Washington, D.C., which is now home to Arlington National Cemetery. Lee fell deeply in love with Mary, and after a long engagement, they married at Arlington House on June 30th, 1831. Mary moved with Lee to Fort Monroe, where he served until 1834. Instead of living with his father-in-law at Arlington House, he chose to stay at a boarding house in Washington. In 1835, Lee went on an expedition to survey the Michigan Territory and continued working for his superiors in Washington, D.C. until 1842, when he was promoted to captain and assigned to Fort Hamilton, a major fortification in New York City. While there, Lee strengthened the fort's defenses to ensure no enemy ships could enter New York Harbor. However, like many officers at that time, everything changed for him with the start of the Mexican-American War in 1846. In an interesting twist of fate, Lee became one of Winfield Scott's engineering advisors. Scott's future opponent at Gettysburg was George Meade, and worked alongside Zachary Taylor. Lee participated in every battle during Scott's campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City, and even got wounded during the siege of Chapultepec. It was during this war that he met a young first lieutenant named Ulysses S. Grant, and saw great potential in him as an officer and leader. After the war ended, Lee was assigned to Fort Carroll in Baltimore for 3 years, where he continued surveying, but also helped out briefly in Florida after it became a state in 1845. The surveying work had been delayed due to fears that Mexico might attack through Florida after their war ended. In 1852, Lee returned to New York after being married for years and having 7 children. However, Mary's health had deteriorated significantly. To avoid moving his family too much due to her condition, Lee became superintendent of West Point Military Academy. He held this position until 1855 and used his time there to reform the curriculum by making engineering a more focused subject for future officers, rather than spreading it thin across other subjects. During his tenure, his son, George Washington Custis Lee, graduated first in his class in 1854. Despite these achievements as an administrator, Lee did not enjoy being away from fieldwork. Robert E. Lee found his time as an administrator boring and longed to return to active duty. In 1855, he was sent to Texas to serve under Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston's cavalry, marking a shift from engineering to direct combat against the Comanche and Apache tribes. However, in 1857, he had to leave Texas when his father-in-law died, inheriting the Arlington estate and its slaves, many of whom were related to George Washington's Mount Vernon slaves. Lee was tasked with managing the estate and following his father-in-law's will, which included gradually freeing the slaves. By 1860, only one family remained intact, as others had been freed or sent away due to uprisings. Lee believed slavery was morally wrong, but struggled with how to free the enslaved without endangering them under the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1859, just as he was preparing to return to Texas, John Brown led a raid at Harper's Ferry on October 16th, attempting to incite a slave rebellion. President James Buchanan called on Lee to command U.S. Marines and retake the armory. Lee succeeded in capturing Brown and his followers, but returned to Texas afterward. During the 1860 election, he and his fellow soldiers were captured by seceding Texans. In March 1861, Lee returned to Washington and was promoted to colonel by President Abraham Lincoln. Around this time, Lincoln offered him a position as Major General of Volunteers. However, 4 Southern states had not yet seceded. When Lincoln called for volunteers, those states joined the rebellion. Lee found himself in a difficult position. He opposed secession and slavery, but could not fight against Virginia, his home state. His former commander, Winfield Scott, tried to persuade him to take command, but Lee refused. He returned to Arlington House, resigned from the U.S. Army, and freed the remaining slaves from the plantation except for older house slaves who accompanied him to Richmond. There, he became commander of Virginia forces, but faced defeat at Cheat Mountain early in the war. After more setbacks in Georgia, he returned to Richmond as military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. When General Joseph Johnston was wounded during the Virginia Peninsula campaign against George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, Lee replaced him. He quickly assessed the situation and drove McClellan out, despite having fewer troops. He later won at Second Manassas, Bull Run, and devised a plan to invade Maryland for supplies and political gain. In September 1862, he faced McClellan again at Sharpsburg, Antietam, but retreated due to supply shortages after the battle. The North celebrated this as a victory, allowing Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and maintain Republican control in Congress. Lee achieved significant victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville before planning another northern invasion. However, after Gettysburg, heavy rains trapped him at the Potomac River while Meade's forces advanced. Lee built strong entrenchments that prevented Meade from attacking, despite criticism of Meade's caution. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant became Commander-in-Chief of Union forces and initiated a war of attrition against Lee's army, while allowing Meade command of the Army of the Potomac. Grant's controversial orders led to widespread destruction in the South, while Lee managed draws at Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Wilderness battles. However, by May 1864, age and war pressures began taking their toll on Lee. Robert E. Lee suffered from dysentery, which rendered him unable to move. While modern treatments make dysentery manageable, in the 1860s it was often fatal. After weeks of evading Union forces, Lee ordered his army to stop and dig trenches around a tavern called Cold Harbor. This marked one of the first instances of trench warfare in the East. When Grant learned of Lee's halt, he aimed to deliver a decisive blow to Lee's army. However, attacking an entrenched enemy in a linear formation is typically disastrous. The battle turned into a massacre, with Union forces suffering around 18,000 casualties. One officer noted that they lost 5,000 men in just 20 minutes. Many of Lee's commanders were stunned by the Union's repeated assaults. Despite winning at Cold Harbor, Lee ultimately lost the overland campaign. Grant strategically crossed the James River, targeting Petersburg, Virginia, a critical supply hub for the Confederacy. If captured, it would allow Union forces to bombard Richmond effectively. Recognizing this threat, Lee fortified Petersburg and summoned reinforcements from Confederate states. Meanwhile, Grant built trench systems around Lee's positions, leading to a siege that lasted from June 1864 to March 1865. During this time, Lee was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate armies, allowing him to override the Confederate government. With Savannah falling in December 1864, Lee understood that he needed new recruits from freed slaves to sustain the war effort. He issued orders for their general emancipation and recruitment into the Army, which some states accepted. Lee also directed General Jubal Early to raid Union holdings from Shenandoah Valley to Washington, D.C. However, Grant dispatched General Phil Sheridan and his cavalry to crush Early's forces. By April 2, 1865, with desertions increasing and Richmond on the brink of capture, Lee's army slipped out of their trenches and attempted to link up with General Joseph Johnston's remaining forces. Exhausted and beaten down, they prepared for a final stand against Grant's combined armies. On April 9, 1865, recognizing the inevitable defeat, Lee rode to Appomattox Courthouse to surrender. Thousands of Union troops watched in silence as he approached William McLean's home. Grant offered clemency. No Confederate soldiers would be treated as criminals if they laid down their arms. Lee had no choice but to sign the surrender documents. As he left McLean's house, silence fell over the field. Grant removed his hat in respect, as did other Union officers. After returning to his army, Lee issued orders for surrender and notified all Confederate commanders to lay down their weapons. He resigned from the Confederate Army and returned home to Richmond. His Arlington estate had been seized by Union forces early in the war and turned into Arlington National Cemetery, a symbolic punishment since many buried there had fought against him. In his later years, Lee advocated for reconciliation and national unity, but was wrongfully linked to Lincoln's assassination due to his prominent position during the war. Upon learning of Lincoln's death, Lee was deeply affected and left a gathering in grief. Interestingly, while wearing his general uniform with 3 stars on his collar, indicative of a colonel, he paid homage to his earlier rank in the Union Army, when Lincoln appointed him as colonel. After the war, Edwin Stanton sought charges against both Lee and Jefferson Davis, but found no evidence linking them to Lincoln's assassination. Lee later became president of Washington University and was one of the first Confederate generals repatriated by President Andrew Johnson. He supported Reconstruction and emancipation, but believed freed slaves should not vote until educated enough, a stance not rooted in blind racism, but rather a belief in their need for preparation. President Grant extended an invitation for Lee to visit the White House as a gesture of unity between North and South. During his presidency at Washington University, he focused on being an example rather than engaging heavily in politics, but remained wary of radical Republicans. On September 28, 1870, Lee suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated until he passed away on October 12th at 9 a.m. Interestingly, he was buried without shoes because his coffin was slightly too small for him. Robert E. Lee was buried beneath the chapel at Washington University, which later became known as Washington and Lee University. The chapel was renamed University Chapel, where Lee, his wife, and children are interred today. Lee remains a controversial figure like many Confederates, but his legacy is often misunderstood due to a lack of context surrounding his life and actions. Lee served as president of Washington College from 1865 until his death in 1870, transforming the institution and its curriculum. After his passing, the college was renamed to honor both George Washington and Robert E. Lee, reflecting their significant contributions to the university's history. As we conclude our exploration of Robert E. Lee, we are left with more questions than answers. Was he a hero, a villain, or simply a product of his time? His legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of bravery and contradiction, loyalty and betrayal, honor and moral ambiguity. Lee's journey from a celebrated military leader to a figure of controversy encapsulates the complexities of the American experience during a tumultuous era. As we reflect on his life, consider how the choices he made resonate in today's discussions about history, race, and identity. What does Lee's story reveal about the nature of leadership and the burdens that come with it? How should we reconcile our admiration for his military genius with the realities of his actions and beliefs? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you interpret Lee's legacy in the context of modern America? Join the conversation as we navigate the intricate layers of history that continue to shape our understanding of who we are today. The dialogue is far from over. Let's keep it going.